All right, so we continue through the book of 2 Corinthians, and Paul starts this section by saying, don't be yoked to non-believers. Now, first off, this is not a reference to marriage. This is not about not marrying somebody who doesn't believe. And actually, Paul is addressing some issues that Corinthian Christians will have to deal with. They are in a particularly difficult spot. So first we're going to explain a little bit of how that is, and then we'll see that it pertains to us in some very deep ways. And then we'll get into the whole temple and weird stuff towards the end. So first off, Corinth, the city of Corinth, as we've talked about before, is incredibly wealthy. It was a port town, so a lot of trade and a lot of travel is moving through there. It's the kind of city where you can buy anything, and I mean anything in the darkest sense. So as people go through, if you noticed, Paul, towards the end of that first section, starts getting into, what does like the temple have to do with idols and that sort of thing. And it turns out that idols were big business in the ancient world. Corinth, like many other Greco-Roman cities, made a ton of money by selling these like idols, these little gods. It wasn't like a temple fundraiser either. It was lucrative. And this whole business of worshiping at these temples and worshiping these idols and such was not like you just have a different religious perspective or something like that. It was much darker. If you needed something, you would first have to figure out which particular god or goddess was in control of that thing. And then you might have to go and buy an idol for X amount of dollars or something like that. Or more likely, you'd go to their particular temple and there would be money changing hands and you'd have to make sacrifices and do this and that. And then maybe this particular god would be coerced or convinced to do for you or give you whatever you're asking. But it's just maybe. The gods were fickle. They were chaotic. They might grant your desire. They might not. And so it would leave you wondering, like, if I didn't get like this kind of prosperity on my voyage, my trading voyage or something like that, well, does that mean that Poseidon is angry with me? Or did I not do things correctly? Now, in case you're wondering that this is just irrelevant history, how many times have you asked the question, God, I've been praying for this for 2 years. Do you not hear me? Do you not care? Is it because I have this sin in my life? Is it because I didn't go to church enough? This is a very relevant issue. And see, God, like the one true God, made it clear from the very beginning that he is not a God that can be coerced or manipulated into giving us what we want. Like that whole commandment, you won't have any graven images, carven images from the 10 Commandments. That is God saying, I am not a God that can be manipulated. You do not have to go before me and grovel and offer these things just so that you will get your way. That is not how I do things. So you have that issue going on with these idols, and we're going to learn in a second that it gets a lot darker than that. But you have some other stuff going on in Corinth too. Corinth is a Greco-Roman city, a lot of Greeks, a lot of Romans doing Greek and Roman things. It also had a decent-sized community of Jewish people. So imagine this for a moment. You have a church, this church in Corinth. And in this church is a sizable number of people who were Greek and Roman. Who are Greek and Roman, but they grew up in that. They have this worldview that the world is full of gods, These gods, if they're in a bad mood, will crush you. You have to manipulate these gods to get what you want. You have to figure out which god is in charge of which thing or element or whatever, and do all of this dog and pony show. And then you have these people come to know that there is only one God. He loved them enough to send his only son into the world. Their sins were forgiven when this only son died, and even death itself was destroyed when God raised this one from the dead. And there is only one God. He is gracious and he is kind. He is your loving Father. You cannot manipulate him. You do not have to do all of these things to get your way. Well, this starts to get complicated. You have to rethink everything, and these old habits die hard. And it's painful. I'll give you a really dumb example, a modern example. When I moved from Southern California after living here for about 9 years, I was born here, we moved to the Deep South. And I would get in trouble with my teachers constantly because they would ask me a question, and I would say, yeah. And she would say, yes, what? Yeah. Yes, what? Yeah. Yes, ma'am. Oh, yes, ma'am. And that took forever. And then, of course, we'd come back to visit California. We'd see all our friends and relatives, and to my elders, so to speak, I'd say, yes, ma'am. And they thought we were making fun of them. Now, that's a dumb example, but multiply that by the fact that this is how you used to construct your world. And now you are learning that these idols and these temples are occupied by things that either just don't exist, it's just a load of nonsense at best, or there is some kind of darker demonic influence at hand. And then add on, and Paul has to deal with this with the Corinthian church, but it's worth mentioning here. Say you're Greek, and you've just started following this Jewish Messiah. He has died for you. You are baptized into his family, and you see like one of the older Jewish members of your church who has been a member of the church since Paul arrived in Corinth first. And we'll call him Ephraim. And you see him walking down the road, and he is having company at his house. And he wants to make hamburgers or whatever you made back then. It'd probably be lamb. And so he's got to get some meat. But you don't buy meat from a grocery store or a market. You have to buy meat from a temple. And all the meat would kind of go through the temple where it was sacrificed to whatever God happened to be there. And so you see this guy. This used to be your world. He's going into this temple. You're saying, why is Ephraim going into that temple? That's either nonsense or demons. And he's buying meat that they'd consider sacred, sacrificed to, I don't know, Zeus. Is that okay? So you have this, that's hard. And it means that sometimes we have to forego our rights for the sake of somebody else. Just because you have a right to do something doesn't mean it's the right thing to do. So you have all of this swirling around, and now Paul is saying, do not associate with the idolatry of your world. That does not mean don't hang out with people. That doesn't mean shun them. But it does mean don't get your business tied up in their businesses, because ancient religion was big business. Don't have all of these connections and influences. Be very careful about how you interact with these idols. Now, idolatry is not something that died out in the ancient world. I'm guessing here that nobody here has like a statue of something that they bow down and worship. I hope. Please say no. I'm guessing you don't make sacrifices to it. I'm guessing, you're modern people, you follow Jesus. That's how that is. You're right. But idolatry does not just mean worshiping idols or making sacrifices in temples. It means looking to something other than God the Creator to tell you who you are, to give you a sense of self, a sense of importance, to bring you comfort or bring you security. These are all things that you should get from God. But we as human beings will look to other things constantly. I've never had somebody come into my office and say, Pastor, I really need to talk to you. I'm really struggling. And I say, okay, come on and sit down. And they've said, Pastor, I struggle because I worship Poseidon. I have yet to have that happen. But I have had people come in kind of crisis mode, sit down, we're talking through, and you can start to hear behind what they're saying that, oh, you worship sex. That is your chief comfort rather than God. Or you worship your success. You worship your status. You worship your status, especially in Orange County, of being like the best mother in the world. You worship your friendships. You worship your marriage. You worship your money. These are all things that become idols. And there is this lie that if you have enough of any of these things, then you will be secure, you will be self-actualized, you will be who you were meant to be. If only I can make X number of dollars more, if I had more of this. None of those things are bad in and of themselves. But when they take the place of God, then they turn into that kind of idol that Paul is saying, don't go there. Because that isn't who you are. The theme for today is when you forget who you are. Because Paul starts saying, like, what does Christ have to do with Belial? And Belial it's a word that means worthless, and has an interesting history. But over time, as people started seeing, ancient Jews really started seeing this worthless thing expand out, they realized that maybe there's a personality behind this evil. This is a demon. Like he's saying, what does Jesus have to do with that? What does a temple have to do with idols? Because you, as Paul says, you are the temple of God. You are the place of God's presence. Now, instead, this is not me saying, you all have these idols in your life, knock it off, though that first part is absolutely true. We all look to and rely on things other than God for our own security. He's not saying knock it off, though. He's saying that's not who you are anymore. You have been baptized into the very death of Jesus. The sin in you, that old man, that brokenness within you went to its grave with Jesus. And when God raised Jesus from the dead, you have been adopted into this family. You are part of this new creation. Those two do not go together. And so he then encourages you. He encourages us that you are like the temple and the presence of God. And if you noticed at the end, he uses this word holiness. And I could talk about like how those two go together just with my words, but that's sometimes gets a little old. There's a video that I'm going to show you. It's about 5 or 6 minutes by a group called The Bible Project. If you want to see more, they have about 1 million videos. They are all for free, just fantastic stuff. TheBibleProject.com. This video is going to explain how that concept of holiness and the temple and God's presence speaks very deeply to who you are in the same way that Paul does as well. So please watch. We'll talk about it for a minute.
You've probably heard the word holy before, or at least sang it in a church song once or twice. And for most people, this idea is really just connected to being a morally good person. So God is holy because he's morally perfect.
Yeah, that is part of it. But in the Bible, the idea of holiness is even bigger and more rich. What it's really describing is how God is the creative force behind the whole universe. He's the one and only being with the power to make a world full of such beauty and life. And so all these abilities, they make God utterly unique, which is the meaning of the word holy. So a helpful way to think about God's holiness is by using the sun as a metaphor. The sun is unique, at least within our solar system, and it's really powerful. It's the source of all this beautiful life on our planet. And so you could say that the sun is holy. And you can actually take this metaphor even further in that the whole area around the sun is also holy.
Yeah, because the closer you get to the sun, the more intense it gets.
Yeah, exactly. So that very power and goodness that generates all this life is also dangerous. I mean, the sun, if you get too close, will annihilate you. And in the same way, there's this paradox at the heart of God's own holiness, because if you're impure, his presence is dangerous to you. And not because it's bad, but because it's so good. And so the first time we see this paradox of God's holiness, it's in the story of Moses and the burning bush.
So God tells Moses to take off his sandals because he's standing on holy ground. And Moses covers his face in fear, and God says, hey, don't come any closer. It's intense.
It's actually that intensity of God's holiness that's explored even more in the stories about Israel's temple, which was the main place where God's holy presence was located. And at the center of the temple was this room called the Most Holy Place, the hot spot of God's presence. And whether you're an Israelite living in the land around the temple or a priest working right in the temple, you're in proximity to God's holy presence, which is dangerous.
Yeah, this is a problem. So how's it supposed to work?
Well, in the Bible, the solution is that you need to become pure.
So like being morally pure.
Yeah, and that's easy enough to understand. But the Bible spends a lot of time talking about another kind of purity, being ritually pure, which is a state where you separate yourself from anything related to death, like touching things like diseased skin or dead bodies or even certain bodily fluids. All these make you impure. And becoming ritually impure isn't necessarily sinful. What's wrong is waltzing into God's presence when you're in an impure state. And so that's why God gave the Israelites very clear instructions for knowing when they were impure, steps to become pure, so that they could go into the temple again.
So that's what the book of Leviticus is about.
Right. But it doesn't stop there. This idea keeps developing. So later in the scriptures, we find this really interesting story by a prophet named Isaiah. And he has this crazy vision where he's in the temple and he's right in God's presence. He's totally terrified.
Yeah, he knows the rules. He shouldn't even be in there. And he's worried about being destroyed.
And then this crazy creature called a seraphim.
Yeah, that is a crazy creature.
Totally. So it flies over with a hot coal, and then it sears Isaiah's lips with the coal and says something really weird. Your guilt is taken away, and your sin is atoned for.
So this burning coal somehow makes Isaiah pure.
Yeah, it's remarkable because normally if you touch something impure, it transfers its impurity to you. But now here's this new idea where you have this coal, this very holy and pure object, and it touches Isaiah, and it transfers its purity to him. Isaiah is not destroyed by God's holiness. He's transformed by it. I mean, the implications of this are just huge. But there's one more development. This time from another prophet, Ezekiel. And he has this vision where he's standing at the temple and he sees water trickling out from it. And then that water turns into a stream, and then it grows into a deep river that starts flowing through the desert, leaving this trail of green trees behind it. And then it flows into the Dead Sea, making everything fresh and alive.
So instead of becoming pure first and then going into the temple, here God's holiness comes out from the temple, making things pure and bringing them to life. What does it all mean?
So we don't know until we meet this man, Jesus. And he claims that he's fulfilling all of these ancient visions, but in surprising new ways. So Jesus, he went around touching people who are impure, people with skin diseases, a woman with chronic bleeding, or dead people. And when he touches them, their impurity should transfer over to Jesus, but instead, Jesus' purity transfers to them and actually heals their bodies.
Jesus is like that holy coal in Isaiah's vision.
Right. And Jesus claimed that he was the human embodiment of God's own holiness, and that he and his followers were now God's temple, so that through them, God's holy presence would go out into the world and bring life and healing and hope. And so this is why Jesus described his followers as having streams of living water flowing out of them.
So this is our part of the story where we find ourselves now, but where's this all heading?
So the last pages of the Bible end with a final vision about God's holiness. And this time it's by a guy named John. And in his vision, we see the whole world made completely new. The entire earth has become God's temple. And Ezekiel's river is there, flowing out of God's presence, immersing all of creation, removing all impurity, and bringing everything back to life.
So again, the theme for this morning is when you forget who you are. And as Paul says, you are people that are holy because Jesus has made you holy. And you are now part of this movement that is being sent into the world to bring God's presence. This whole idolatry thing that we all struggle with, this worship of other things to bring us a sense of identity and comfort and security, like that just isn't who you are anymore, although it's easy to forget. So my prayer for us today is that we will, when we forget who we are, we will know that God has made us holy. That part of us that still struggles to worship these other things is not who we are and is not who God is making us to be. That we are bringing the presence of God into the world like Ezekiel's vision of water flowing from the temple. Let's pray.